All right, welcome back, everyone. So now we've got our ChatGPT clone pretty far along. In this lesson, we're going to clean up the conversation page and make it look much more like a chat app. We'll start by removing the default conversation name. We'll add the initial behavior into the UI so that the user can see what the initial behavior is. And then we'll format the messages to make them look a lot better. And then finally, we'll add a waiting animation so that the user can tell that we're waiting for OpenAI to respond. All right, so let's get started with removing the default conversation name. And you can see what I mean by that when I click on one of the conversations on the left. When I select one, you can see it flashes the word name. It's very quick. You won't always see it, but sometimes you do. So this is an easy fix in the studio. So the reason that name defaults in is because the word name is actually in the text box. So let's remove the word name from here. So that way it defaults to having no display text. And now if we go back to the preview, we can see when I select one, it no longer flashes the word name first. So next, let's add the initial behavior value as subtext underneath the conversation name here. So that way it's obvious to the user what behavior to expect from the AI. This is also a quick and easy setup. Let's go back into the studio again. And I'm going to drop a new element. We'll drop a text box. And I'm just going to put it right here under conversation name, or I can drop it into the header element, which will drop it under the conversation name as well. Just like we did to the name, I'm going to go ahead and remove the display text. And we'll name the element initial behavior. And then we need to bind our data to it. So if we go look at the conversation name, how it's set up, if you remember, we pull it from a field, from the conversation collection, from the name field. We'll do a very similar setup on initial behavior. We'll pull it from a field, from the conversations collection, but from the initial behavior field. So now let's jump back into the preview and take a look. Just reselect the conversation. We can now see the initial behavior right here below the conversation name on each conversation. All right, so the third thing we want to do is format these messages. So first, let's note that the message itself needs to be formatted. ChatGPT very likely responded with carriage returns or line breaks inside of there, but because I'm using a paragraph element, the formatting of it isn't displaying it right. So we're going to switch this element type. We're going to drop a new element called Markdown Display. Markdown is a commonly used format for displaying text like this. We can even tell ChatGPT to always respond in proper Markdown in the future. But for now, just using the Markdown element should make this format a lot better. So let's go back to the studio and swap that element type out. So we'll go to our conversation message page, and we'll insert a new element called Markdown. We'll drop that into the same container as the message, and we'll kind of copy some of its settings. So if we look at the data, for instance, it's coming from messages, message field. We'll do the same setup here. So from messages and the message field. And then I'm just going to delete this one. And that's really all we have to do here. So now if we go back to our preview, we can see now that this has much cleaner formatting. I think we should probably put a max width on this messages field so that the text wraps somewhere in here. Super easy to do as well. Jump back in. We'll go to our styling, and I'm just going to do this in inline. Go to size, and we'll set a max width, say 700 pixels. Back to the preview, reselect nutrition. That looks a bit better. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is make it obvious which row is from a user and which row is a response from our AI. And I think we should do that with a couple of different visual cues. One is we should put a background color on each row that's dependent on the type of row it is. So we have two types of rows right now. One is a user message, and one is what's called the assistant message, which is the response. So what we want to do is make a condition on the type. If it's type user, then we'll set one background color. If it's type assistant, we'll have a different background color. I think we should also put a little icon on the left side to denote who's sending the message. And what's great about that is for a user message, we can actually set in the current user's avatar if they've set one in their profile. And this entire profile setup comes automatically with the Mullen template that we use to start this project. So anytime the user can go to the profile, upload an image, and put in their name. And then for the assistant response rows, we'll use our icon, the one that we're using for this app. So we'll start that process by looking at how each row stores its type. So we'll go back into the studio. Let's go to data collections and go to the messages collection. So each record here you can see has a type, user or assistant. There's actually a third type called system as well that we'll get into in another lesson. But for now, we just need to worry about these two, user or assistant. So what we'll do is go back to our conversation message page. And on that page, on our outer, we're going to make a couple of style classes. So I'm going to change the name here first to outer. I'll make a new primary style class and we'll give it a name. And then we'll edit our class. All right, let's start by putting some padding around the message. So I'll add padding of 1 EM all the way around. And I think I'll make the top and the bottom 0.5 EM because the message text itself will have some spacing already. And then we also need to give it a background color. So we'll go to background and we'll set a background color. I'll use an RGBA, but really you can use anything you'd like. Okay, so now we've got padding and background color. Let's go take a look at the preview and just see what it looks like. Okay, so we can now clearly see where our conversation is, but we definitely need to show the difference between our question and the answer. I think I'll add a little more left padding, and then we'll add an if-then logic action to check to see if the type is assistant, and if it is, then we'll change the background color a little bit. So let's go do that. So I'll go back to spacing. I'll add a little more padding to the left, and I'll make the same adjustment on the right. Go look one more time at the preview. Yeah, I like the way that looks better. Okay. Now let's add a logic action to check to see if the type is assistant. So we'll go to flows, and on page load, let's add a new action for logic. We'll use if-then logic. And the value we're going to test is a field value from the current record. Our current record is a message, and the field value we're looking for is type. And if that value equals assistant, then we'll need to make a new flow that runs when that occurs. So we'll make a new flow, we'll give it a name, and we'll add a new action here that adds a style property. This action that sets a style property on an element allows you to select an element, which we're going to select our outer, set a specific property name, in our case, background color, and put a particular value in. And what I want to put is a little bit different background color than what we had. So that'll be a little bit lighter than the darker background color that we placed on by default. And we'll go back to our page load flow, back to our if-then logic check, and if it's true, meaning if the type equals assistant, we'll run our new flow type equals assistant. Otherwise, we're just not going to do anything. So by default, it'll be one color. And if this conditional statement is true, it will then run the flow type equals assistant, which sets the new background color only for the rows that match that type. Let's take a look at it in the preview. So if I re-click on nutrition, it will run all the flows again because it reloads all those pages. So now we can see that our question is a bit darker, our answer is a bit lighter. And if we ask it another question, we can see how that'll look flowing down the page. All right. So I've got one question and an answer, another question and another answer. Now, these answers are getting pretty long, and to see them, I have to scroll down. So we should modify this setup a little bit to make it so that certain parts of our display are persistent and other parts have scroll. In particular, what I want to do is make the header a little bit smaller and make it always stuck to the top. We'll make the enter a message container always stuck to the bottom, and we'll make this inner area have the scroll inside. So that way you always have the context of what the conversation is, and you have the input available at all times. So let's go make those changes now. So first, we just need to remove the margin on the top of the heading. So by default, headings have pretty big margin. What I'll do is click on the inline styling, which will override any styles that have been applied. I'll go to spacing, and on margin, I'll just enter a 0 here. So let's go back and take a look at how that looks and make sure we're okay with it. We'll reselect. Yeah, that's much better. I'll add a little bit more margin to the top, just so that way it stays even with this left side. I'll change this to EMs because that's the unit of measure I like to work in. And I'm going to go with half an EM. Reselect nutrition again. Might have been a little bit too much. Let's try 0.25. Back one more time. Reselect. Yeah, I think that looks great now. Now let's take a look at how the structure of the page is causing the overflow to happen at the parent level at the very top. What I want is for this outer container to be a maximum height and be stuck at that height, and this inner container that has the list of messages in it to have the scroll inside of it. So if you recall the way that we set the containers up on this page, there's an outer container on the conversation page with the setting of display flex. And then each main area of the page is a row. So we have the header row, we have a body row, which contains all the messages, and then we have a footer row, which contains the ability to enter a new message. So in order to make the middle row have overflow to where it scrolls, what we'll do is set a height on that container, and we'll use a CSS property called overflow, which is what controls whether or not elements inside of a container overflow the bounds of the container or have a scroll bar so that they're contained within the container. So we can go set those settings in the studio pretty easily. We'll go to our conversation details page, and on the body container, I believe we already have a style class that we created before. The first thing we need is to make sure that there's a size. Because the parent is display flex, it is going to require some size to it. I'll just put 100 pixels, but it's fairly arbitrary here. And then the second thing we need to do is set the overflow. I'll set this to overflow auto, which means that if there's too much content for the container, it will have a scroll bar. And if there's not too much content for the container, then it will not have a scroll bar. So we can go back to the preview and see how this looks. Now you can see that our messages scroll inside of the header at the top and the footer at the bottom. And if we add another message, we can really get a feel for it. All right, so that's pretty cool. We can now scroll up and down, view the full message history anytime we want to, but we're kept in context all the time. I think I'll go make our icon at the top a bit smaller, so that way we see a little bit more of the message history. So I'll go back in, go to our header. I think we had done 60 pixels. Let's change that size, maybe to 40. Let's go a good bit smaller. Yeah, that's better. Awesome. All right, so next, let's put an icon on the left of each of these. If it's of type user, then we'll show the user's icon if they put one in from their profile. If it's of type assistant, then we'll go ahead and show the icon of our app. So to do that, go to the message page. And I'm going to insert a new element, an image element. Put that here. I'll change the default on it to just be empty. Now we also need to change the formatting of our outer container. So that way it'll display everything properly in one row. I like to use display flex for this. Some people use grid. My preference is flex. So I'll set this to display flex. We want flex direction to be row, meaning there's going to be a single row of columns. And we don't want it to wrap because we want the image on the left and the text on the right. I'll justify content to the left, and I'm going to align the items in the center. So that should give us a nice row. Now on my image, I'll also add a margin on the right side. So we'll go to spacing, we'll go to margin right, and I'll do 0.5 EMs. So that way there's space between the image and the message. And then I'm also going to set a size here. We'll force it into a 20 pixel by 20 pixel size. So that way it's always that size, even if there's no image in it. And it forces all the images to be the same size when they're set in here. Now I'll go back to feathericons.com like we did before. This time I'll search for user, and I'll click on one to download it. And then back in the studio, we'll open the media library and we'll upload it. All right, so now we need to make a logic action that checks to see what type it is. And then based on that, sets either the user's image or sets the icon of our project. And then I'll also do an additional logic check. If there is no user image, set our empty user image that I just got from Feather Icons. So we're going to do a multi-step if-then logic flow here. So I'll go to flows, and we can piggyback on the logic we already had here. So we're already checking if it's assistant. If it's not assistant, we know that it's type user. So what I can do is make a new flow called type equals user and set it up to where if it's not assistant, then assume it's user and run that flow. And then inside of our type equals assistant and new type equals user flows, we can set the appropriate image. So I'll make a new flow and give it a name. And then in that action, we'll select that flow. So again, now if it's type equals assistant, then we'll go to assistant. Otherwise, we'll go user. Now, if it's assistant, what we want to do is add an action for setting a value of an element. So remember, in our type equals assistant, it's already setting that background color. We're also going to have it set our image with the icon from our project. So we'll select the image, and then for the value, we're actually going to pull that from our media library. And we'll select the file directly from there. So we'll choose the same image that we use for our icon. So for user, it'll be a little bit different. So let's make two new flows, one that sets the current user's image and one that sets the new image from Feather. And then in type equals user, we'll create an if-then logic statement to do one or the other. So I'll make a new flow. We'll give it a name. And I'll make another new flow for whenever there's no user image on the profile. And these two flows are going to do very similar actions to that action that we created over in the assistant. So I'm going to copy this flow and paste it into these. When the user image is default, we want the image to come from our media library from that user image that we uploaded. When it's profile, we want to paste the same thing in, but instead of coming from our media library, we want to pull it from the current user's information. And there's a field on our user called image. And then our last step is to go back to the type equals user flow and add our if-then logic check. So we'll add an action here. The value we're going to test is if the current user information image equals empty, then put the default. Otherwise, put the profile. So now we've chained together some logic here. On page load, it's going to check to see what type it is. If it's not assistant, it's going to assume it's user and run through type equals user, which then just runs another logic check to see if the current user has an image or not. If the current user does not have an image, then it'll put the default image in there. If it does have an image, then it'll put the profile image from that user in there. All right, so let's go check this out on the preview now. So you can see our images are already there, but I do need to reselect it so that it reloads and runs all those flows we just created. Nice. So we need to add some more margin on the right for sure. And then also we should actually position this top instead of positioning it in the center like we did in the Flex setup. So those two things are really easy to do. Let's go back into the studio and set them up. So on our spacing on our image, we're just going to add some more over here. Probably do like 1.5 maybe, something like that. We'll come look again. Yeah, that's better. Okay, now let's go take care of that positioning. That's in our outer, in our message row. In the layout settings, this one right here where we put the align items to be center, we actually want to do that top. It's close, but it looks like we need a little bit of margin on the top because this has margin. Text by default is going to have margin, so to get that just right, I think we just need to do 1 EM margin on the top and it should be perfect. So we'll go back over to our image again, go back to our spacing, and on the top, we'll put 1 EM on there. All right, now we're looking good. Cool. All right, so the last thing to do is add a waiting message, which I do think is pretty important here, because when the user actually submits a message, it can take a little bit for OpenAI to respond. Sometimes it's 5 seconds or 2 seconds. Sometimes it's 45 seconds or a minute. So it would be good to let the user know that we're working. Now, I like to use a tool called Lottie. Lottie is a type of animation that you can use all over the web. And in particular, I use a place called lottiefiles.com to find different animations that I want to use in my project. So I did a search here for waiting dots. And some of these are free and some of these are paid. If you do a filter for free, you'll find all the free ones. Some of the premium ones can get really, really nice too. There's some nice stuff in here. But I'll switch to free. I think I'll probably use this one here. And then all we need to do is just copy the animation URL by clicking on this button here. And we actually have an element type built into Bildr specifically for displaying Lottie animations. If we go back to the studio, we'll drop a Lottie animation into our chat box footer here. So we'll go to Element, Insert Element, search for Lottie, and you'll see it come up. So we'll drop that into our chat box. And you can see we have a default one there. I'm going to change the URL and just paste what I had copied. There's our Lottie. And we do need to make this a bit smaller. And we also need to make it default to not even being displayed. So first thing, in the styling, I'll go to my inline style and I'll change the size. We're going to put a width on it of say 50 pixels. Yeah, so that looks good. And we'll put a height on it of say 30 pixels. All right, cool. So let's add one more thing. I'm going to put an outer container around the Lottie animation, and then we're going to default that outer container to display none, which will make the whole thing be hidden by default. So we'll go to Element, New Element, and then we'll drag and drop a div into our chat box. We'll drag the Lottie animation into the div, and I'll name it Lottie Outer. In our styling, we're going to inline styling to layout and set display none. So now by default, our Lottie Outer is hidden and anything inside of it is hidden. Next, we need to modify the flow when a message is sent to hide our send button and show our Lottie. And then we also need to set up a flow that does the opposite that we can run after OpenAI has successfully responded. So we'll go to flows, we'll go to our send message flow, and we're going to add 2 actions into this flow, one to hide the send button and one to show the Lottie. So first I'm going to rename our image here, which is our send button, to be called image send button. That way it's a little easier to notice which element is which when we're searching for it in different menus. Let's go over to flows and go into the send message flow. We'll add 2 actions here. The first action will hide the send button, and the second action will show the Lottie animation. So we'll add an action. We'll use this hide completely action. We'll drag it to the top so it runs first, and then we'll select our image send button. We'll add another action for show that will show an element. We'll drag that up as well, and we'll select our Lottie Outer. Now remember in our OpenAI chat action, at the very bottom, we had set the flow to run after a successful response to run the page binding, which refreshes our repeating list. But now we need it to do 2 things. We need it to run the page binding, but we also need to do the opposite of what we just did by hiding and showing those elements. So let's make a new flow that will do all those things. So we'll make a new flow, We'll give it a name. And in our new flow, the first thing we'll do is nest the page binding because we still want that to run. We'll add another hide action, but instead of hiding our image send button, we're going to hide the Lottie. And we'll add another show action, but instead of showing the Lottie, we'll show the image send button. And then the last step is to go back into our send flow, go back to the OpenAI chat, and in the flow to run after a successful response, change it from page binding to after chat success, which will run the page binding and then also hide and show the elements appropriately. All right, and that should be it. So let's go take a look. Go back to our preview. We'll put a new message in. We'll send that over. All right, now we have a nice little waiting animation. Taking OpenAI a minute, which happens. All right, and it finished. Fantastic. So now the user has some visual cue that something is happening. So that's it for this lesson on cleaning up the conversation page. We've already got another lesson in the works. We're excited to get more of these out to you. Thanks again for watching.